12 million people were watching when Whoopi Goldberg defended her claim that the Holocaust wasn't about race. Jasmine Crockett didn't stay silent. On live television, she pushed back with truth, turned the studio upside down, and exposed what had been ignored for too long. The backlash was swift: public outrage, academic pressure, and calls for Whoopi to step away from the view. So what exactly did Jasmine Crockett say that no one else had the courage to? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under a crimson-tinted banner reading "The View a Nation Reflects," ABC launched what it called a special live broadcast on the evolution of political thought in American culture. Every major platform, from cable news tickers to Instagram countdowns, buzzed with anticipation. Headlines teased a generational dialogue between veteran media titan Whoopi Goldberg and rising congressional firebrand Jasmine Crockett. The seating arrangement was symbolic. Whoopi centered, flanked by loyal co-hosts, while a solitary chair across from her awaited Crockett, like a throne in a televised tribunal. Viewers were told this would be a thoughtful exchange, but behind the scenes the power dynamics were anything but balanced. Goldberg, who had suggested the topic herself, had coordinated the framing, the questions, and even the visual cues. This wasn't a discussion. It was intended to be an ambush under the guise of civility, a platform for Goldberg to reaffirm her moral authority and silence inconvenient truths with applause lines and veteran poise. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't arriving empty-handed. Beneath her poised exterior and carefully layered blazer was a silent arsenal, a binder of receipts, as she called it privately. Inside, printouts of Goldberg's infamous Holocaust comments, archived transcripts of her 2009 defense of Roman Polanski, and side-by-side excerpts of media reactions, some excusing, some condemning. She had annotated them in red ink, highlighting every euphemism, every dodge, every moment America let an icon rewrite history in real time. She knew Goldberg wasn't just a host today, she was the gatekeeper of televised morality. But Crockett, a black woman from Texas, who'd fought her way through systemic bias and institutional gaslighting, wasn't intimidated by legends. Not anymore. "If they invite me to play chess on their board," she had told her aide that morning, "I'll flip the board." And so, as the countdown ticked to zero and the studio lights ignited like the start of a televised duel, Jasmine Crockett took her seat, not as a guest, but as a woman entering a room where the rules had been written against her. The air was cool but tight, like the breath before a storm. The set glowed with the soft blues and golds of morning television, chosen to suggest warmth, trust, and comfort. But beneath the polish lay invisible tripwires, questions meant to provoke, laughter timed to undermine, and a host whose legacy acted like armor. The applause faded, and all eyes turned to the center of the table, where Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward with a grandmother's grin, so familiar it had once lulled America into forgetting she too was fallible. Jasmine didn't blink. Her back straightened, not from fear, but from the awareness that this wasn't a dialogue. It was a game of proximity to power, and the closer one sat to it, the easier it was to get burned. The morning jingle gave way to applause, the audience smiling on cue, the atmosphere curated for comfort. It felt familiar in the way a velvet rope feels, welcoming to some, restrictive to others. Whoopi adjusted her chair, leaned in just enough to command attention, and began as she had many times before. But this time Jasmine sensed the tension behind the charm, like a wire humming beneath her seat. "You know," Whoopi began with a chuckle, "when I first got into this business, I had a casting director tell me I wasn't camera pretty. I said, 'Good, the camera ain't my mirror, baby.'" The audience laughed. She continued, perfectly timed. "Then there was the exec who said, 'We've already got a black actress in the lineup.' I told him, 'Well, then I guess y'all solved racism with one episode.'" More laughter. Then she added, raising an eyebrow, "Let's be real. They'd still be racist even if they gave everybody a hug." The crowd roared. The energy was light, almost disarming. The cameras swept across smiling faces. It looked like a living room chat, but everyone knew what it really was: control disguised as charisma. Then the shift. Whoopi's tone softened, but her words sharpened. These days, she said, people go online, read some crazy theory, and by afternoon, they've convinced their grandma the government is run by aliens. Laughter erupted, loud, theatrical. She let it ride, then added, and somehow, those same folks end up in Congress. It wasn't a joke. It was a scalpel, an accusation without a name. But everyone knew who she meant. Jasmine Crockett sat still, her lips curled into the faintest smile. Not out of amusement, but calculation. The jab was precise but predictable. She'd heard it before. The veiled shots, the performative laughter, the cynicism masking as wisdom. She didn't blink. She let the applause play out like background static in a courtroom. She was trained for this. And while the room clapped for Goldberg's wit, Crockett's fingers hovered near the folder in her lap, the one filled with every receipt they thought she wouldn't bring. Not yet, but soon. This wasn't just a conversation. It was an ambush dressed in soft lighting and polite applause. And Crockett? She wasn't here to play defense. She was waiting, not for her turn to speak, but for the moment the room would regret underestimating her. She waited for the applause to die, not because it bothered her, but because she understood what came after was far more dangerous than the applause itself. Applause was theater. Applause was safe. Silence, on the other hand, was honest. Silence was where truth either bloomed or withered. Jasmine Crockett had lived long enough in rooms where people only listened to respond. She knew how to weaponize stillness. And in that narrow, pulseless space between Goldberg's last smirk and the next prompt on the teleprompter, she inhaled once, then exhaled everything she'd brought into the building. The moderator, careful to keep the atmosphere respectful, leaned slightly toward her with a question that had clearly been pre-approved. Congresswoman Crockett, what do you think is the real danger of language in today's political landscape? It was meant to be a bridge, a chance for her to talk broadly, to be agreeable, to not make things uncomfortable. But Crockett hadn't come to the View to be agreeable. She hadn't traveled across the country under tight security and stricter press protocols just to deliver platitudes. This wasn't a panel. This wasn't brunch. This was a battlefield, and the moment had finally arrived. She didn't look at the moderator. She didn't glance down at her notes. Her hands stayed still, folded on her lap like iron gates that wouldn't swing open until they were damn well ready. Slowly she leaned in, not dramatically, but deliberately, her eyes trained directly on the center of the table, where Whoopi Goldberg sat with her hands clasped and her lips just beginning to curl into that same disarming grin that had warmed American living rooms for generations. But Jasmine didn't smile back. She didn't soften. There was no heat in her voice, no hesitation, just the quiet edge of steel sharpening against reality. We cannot keep pretending that only Black people have been the victims of systemic racism, she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. It landed heavy, unblinking. The Holocaust was a racial genocide. Period. The studio's soundproofing suddenly felt like it had failed. A dense, collective hush swallowed the room, not because they didn't understand, but because they absolutely did. The line between audience and spectacle blurred. Camera operators went still behind their lenses. Stagehands stood frozen just beyond the lights, eyes flicking between the floor director's panicked hand gestures and the woman at the table who had just changed the temperature of the air. Jasmine turned her full attention to Whoopi, slowly, not as an attack, but as an act of precision, a surgeon revealing the truth, not slashing with it. And when the person holding this microphone once said, "The Holocaust wasn't about race," she continued, "I think it's time America asks who we let define the narrative." She let the words hang there. She didn't fill the silence. She didn't chase it with an explanation or a smile to soften the blow. Because that was the point. There was no blow. There was no performance. What she'd said wasn't controversial. It was historical. What made it dangerous was the platform, the stage, the microphone, and who had been allowed to hold it for too long without consequence. Across the table, Goldberg's posture didn't move, but the veneer cracked, just slightly. It was there in the blink that lasted 1 second too long, in the way her fingers gripped her note cards with just a bit more tension than before. in the sharp breath she took through her nose, the kind that comes when a person prepares to respond not with reason, but with defense. But Goldberg said nothing, not yet. Somewhere near the front row, a man in a gray jacket lowered his phone and began recording again. Not because anything outrageous had been said, but because it was clear, instinctively clear, that something irreversible had just happened. Jasmine had shifted the energy of the room in a way no lighting or applause button could undo. A rupture had occurred, not in anger, not in outrage, but in unfiltered clarity. This wasn't the viral moment the producers had hoped for. It wasn't snappy or meme-worthy. It was too raw, too grounded, the kind of truth that didn't go down easy because it exposed something deeper than scandal. It questioned who America trusted to speak for it. In that suspended silence, Jasmine could feel the difference. She could feel the space around her tighten, not with hostility, but with awareness. This was the part no one prepped her for. Not law school, not the campaign trail, not even the floor of Congress. There was no podium to hide behind, no official time limit, just her voice, and a nation on the other side of the lens that had grown far too comfortable with hearing history from the wrong mouths. She hadn't come to accuse. She'd come to correct. And sometimes the most devastating correction is the one that leaves no room for rebuttal, only reflection. And just like that, the silence snapped, not with applause or outrage, but with a voice trying to reclaim control. Whoopi Goldberg straightened slightly in her chair, the confidence in her posture a shade more brittle than it had been 10 minutes earlier. Her voice came out lower than usual, tinged with something between uncertainty and offense. "I'm not denying the Holocaust," she began. The sentence rushed, like it had been waiting backstage, rehearsed but unsteady. "I just always understood it to be between two groups of white people." The words fell out fast, tangled in the same logic that had nearly ended her career once before. The moment she said it, the tension in the room didn't spike. It thickened, like heat pressing against a closed window. The air conditioner hummed audibly now, a subtle reminder of how quiet the room had become. A few audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The crew behind the cameras didn't dare blink. And across the table, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't interject. She didn't smirk. She simply held the silence and let it work like gravity, pulling the weight of Goldberg's words down until they collapsed under their own contradiction. Because in that moment, Whoopi wasn't just responding. She was unraveling, and she didn't even know it yet. The air in the studio had turned. What once felt like warmth, curated for morning television, had curdled into something else, something raw and unscripted. There was no music to cut to, no clever edit to soften the blow. Just two women seated across from each other at a glass table, the weight of history and accountability suspended between them. Whoopi Goldberg's words still hung in the air, fragile and unfinished, like a bridge built too late over a river already flooding. She had spoken not out of malice, perhaps, but from the soft arrogance of having never been truly challenged, of having spent decades wrapped in applause thick enough to muffle consequence. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here for permission. She was here for correction. The pause that followed Whoopi's statement lasted just long enough for regret to creep in. But Jasmine Crockett didn't give it the space to settle. She leaned forward, her voice clear, her tone slicing through the tension like a scalpel through gauze. "No," she said, firm but unshaken. "It wasn't between two groups of white people. It was the systemic extermination of a race, sanctioned by a government, executed by policy." Her words didn't rise in volume, but they reverberated with a clarity that pierced the haze of celebrity immunity. She didn't blink. When public figures start redefining history based on personal emotion, that's when conscience collapses, she added, her gaze locked not on Whoopi's face, but on the weight her legacy carried, unchecked for too long. And then without hesitation, she turned the blade sharper. "Let's not forget, you once said about Roman Polanski, it wasn't rape. There was no immediate reaction, only a sharp collective inhalation, the kind that comes before the room decides whether to erupt or recoil. It was like watching a courtroom the moment a hidden piece of evidence is revealed. Unexpected, devastating, undeniable. Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't postured. She had simply pulled truth from the shadows and laid it, unflinching, at the center of the table. And the impact was seismic. One half of the audience erupted into a ripple of applause, sharp and spontaneous, as if the silence had betrayed them long enough. The other half hesitated. Some eyes widened, others narrowed, and more than a few phones rose silently into the air, recording not just the moment, but the face of the woman now being held accountable in real time. Whoopi Goldberg remained seated, but something inside her had visibly shifted. The ease, the practiced warmth, the velvet armor of her celebrity, it all flickered. Her eyes didn't meet Jasmine's. Instead, they darted, as if searching for the script that had just been torched. And across from her, Crockett sat still, composed, anchored by something more powerful than applause. Moral clarity. She wasn't angry. She wasn't gloating. She was simply finished pretending that legacy could substitute for truth. The camera didn't cut away. There was nowhere to run. The moment had demanded honesty, and Jasmine Crockett had delivered it with surgical precision. Now the studio, the country, and even Goldberg herself would have to decide. Was this just a heated exchange on a talk show? Or was this the day the conversation finally changed? The silence following Jasmine's last words was not the kind that faded. It calcified. Cameras kept rolling, but no one behind them dared to breathe too loudly. Even the steady hum of the studio lights seemed to retreat into the background, like they, too, recognized the weight of what had just occurred. And across the table, Whoopi Goldberg sat visibly unsettled. Not devastated, not defeated, but disoriented in a way only someone long protected by applause could feel. It wasn't just that she'd been challenged. It was that she had been challenged without fear. In a room built to elevate her voice, someone had spoken louder without raising theirs. There was no moderator stepping in, no cheerful co-host cracking a joke to change the subject, no teleprompter cue offering a safe pivot. No one wanted to be the one to touch the third rail. The show had slipped its leash. This was no longer a segment. It was something else now, something irreversible. And in the absence of rescue, Goldberg did what power often does when cornered. She reached for her story. Not the one being questioned, but the one she'd spent her life constructing, the story of impact, of resilience, of cultural relevance that had made her a household name and a voice millions trusted. Her voice didn't tremble, but it didn't land with its usual gravity either. "I've spent my whole life telling stories that matter," she began, the words rolling out with the cadence of someone trying to anchor herself. "I've broken barriers, challenged Hollywood, brought conversations to the table no one else would." She paused as if expecting applause to fill the gap, out of respect, out of habit. But there was none. No camera panned to a nodding audience member. No affirming hum from the crowd. Just the low, almost imperceptible sound of someone shifting in their chair. The rustle of a jacket sleeve, a cough quickly stifled. It wasn't rejection. It was realization. The room wasn't with her, not anymore. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't smirk, didn't seize the silence with triumph. She simply responded like someone who had seen this defense strategy too many times to be moved by it. Her voice came slowly, each word shaped with precision and weight. "The media can't keep being a washing machine for celebrity wrongdoing, scrubbing history clean with time. And awards," she said. There was no venom in it, only truth. No exaggeration, just clarity. Cancel culture doesn't pick victims. It just reveals truths that power tried to bury. That was the moment it changed. The precise second, the last thread connecting this conversation to the structure of a daytime talk show, finally snapped. Whatever this program had planned, whatever arcs or recovery moments had been scheduled, none of it mattered now. The audience knew it. The crew knew it. America, watching from couches and break rooms and barbershops, knew it. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was evidence. This wasn't banter. It was testimony. A courtroom without a bench, a trial without a gavel, but a trial all the same. And in the witness chair sat a woman who had lived on both sides of injustice and wasn't afraid to name it. For Goldberg, the realization landed slowly, painfully, like trying to hold water in a paper cup. She had called on legacy to protect her, but legacy was no longer immune. She had summoned her past as a shield, but shields don't work when the threat is truth. And Jasmine's truth wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive. It was clear. It was undeniable. And it made everything else, celebrity, seniority, sentimentality, feel suddenly small. There was no music cue, no gentle fade to commercial. The cameras were still rolling, but now they weren't just documenting a conversation. They were witnessing a moment of cultural reversal. The very set, polished and pastel, designed to feel soft and feminine and forgiving, had transformed into something far less comfortable. A courtroom cloaked in smiles where justice was finally speaking into the microphone. Not in anger, not in vengeance, but in truth, unfiltered and unafraid. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't just holding her ground. She was shifting it. And just when it seemed the weight of truth might finally press the room into full silence, Whoopi reached, not for defiance, but for sympathy. Her posture softened, her shoulders fell slightly, and she leaned on the one thing that had never failed her before: longevity. "I've been on television for over 40 years, she said, her voice lower now, almost intimate, like she was confiding something rather than defending it. "I know how complicated language can be, how fast things can come out wrong. I've lived the evolution of how we talk about race, history, trauma. I've made mistakes, sure, but I've also helped this country face some hard truths." There was a faint tremor in her tone, the kind that lives somewhere between vulnerability and calculation. It wasn't an admission, it was a redirect. And for the first time that morning, she wasn't appealing to logic or experience. She was appealing to emotion, hoping that 4 decades in the public eye could substitute for clarity. But Crockett didn't flinch, because when systems fail to hold power accountable, emotion becomes a shield. And Jasmine had come to break through that shield with something far sharper: memory, principle, and the one thing legacy fears most: clarity. Goldberg's final defense had barely landed before the silence that followed made it irrelevant. Her words hung there like steam from a cooling engine, visible for a moment, then gone. She had pulled the oldest card in the deck: tenure, sentiment, emotion. The same card that had bought her space, time, and forgiveness in every other room she'd ever walked into. And for a second, just a second, she might have believed it would work again. That her story of barriers broken, decades survived, systems challenged, might still be enough to explain away this one moment of reckoning. But across from her sat a woman unmoved by legacy and unthreatened by stature. Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to this table to be folded into someone else's redemption arc. She had come with facts. She had come with history. And now she was going to use both. She didn't lean back. She didn't pause. She didn't let Whoopi finish the breath between sentences. She stepped in, quiet but definitive, and carved through the velvet with a blade of truth. "Responsibility isn't measured in broadcast years," she said, her voice sharp and grounded. "It's measured by the impact of the harm we cause when we speak wrongly and refuse to own it." The room shifted again, not loudly but deeply, like the foundation beneath the studio had tilted 3 degrees to the left, and now no one could sit quite as comfortably. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform. She delivered the line like someone who had carried its truth in her mouth for months, waiting for this exact moment to let it out. There was no cruelty, no spectacle, just a cold, steady reminder that time doesn't erase damage, especially when the damage keeps spreading. Then calmly, she reached for the folder in her lap. A simple manila folder, the kind that looked boring until it became dangerous. She opened it without drama and pulled out a single printed page. Black text, highlighted sections, footnotes. It was the opposite of what television expected. No props, no punchlines, just the weight of documentation. "After your 2022 statement that the Holocaust wasn't about race," she said without breaking eye contact, "online Holocaust denial surged by 38% in just 2 weeks. The numbers weren't an attack. They were a mirror. Denial sites cited your clip. Hate forums amplified it. People used your words to erase 6 million deaths." The room didn't gasp. Gasping was for theatrics. This moment was too still, too surgical for that. A sound technician in the back lowered his headset. One of the audience members, an older woman with her hand still clutching her phone, slowly set it down on her thigh, as if even holding it felt disrespectful now. The tension wasn't coming from what Jasmine had said. It was coming from the certainty with which she said it. Not a theory, not a feeling. A traceable, measurable harm, tied to a face America had never been asked to question. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't soften. Her eyes didn't ask for permission to keep going. She knew what this moment required. Television isn't a stage to rinse the past clean with fame, she said. It's supposed to be where we restore truth, with integrity. There was no performative pause. No, let me finish. No plea for understanding. She had said what needed to be said, and anything else would only dilute its precision. She slid the page across the table, not as an act of confrontation, but of offering. Let the record show, let the camera capture it, let the nation decide for itself. For a long beat, Whoopi didn't touch the paper. She didn't look down at it, and Jasmine didn't force her to, because in this moment, the power wasn't in what would be read, it was in what had already been spoken, clearly, calmly, finally. It didn't take long for the silence to reach the outside world. In fact, by the time Jasmine Crockett's printed page finished its slow glide across the polished studio table, the moment was already gone, ripped from the broadcast feed by 3 separate audience members, each recording from slightly different angles. One caught the full exchange from the left-hand risers, another framed tightly on Jasmine's unflinching expression, and the third captured Whoopi's face, caught between pride and panic as her hands hovered, uncertain, over the document in front of her. No camera switch, no network filter, no editorial delay, just raw truth leaking through glass screens at 24 frames per second. The war of perception had left the studio and entered a domain where legacy had no script. The internet. Within 12 minutes, the first clip, 45 seconds long, shaky but intelligible, was uploaded to TikTok by a college sophomore in Brooklyn, captioned only with, "She said it, finally." In 5 minutes, it had 3,000 views. In 10 minutes, 45,000. By 20 minutes, it had crossed 1 million, and the comments multiplied like aftershocks. She didn't even blink. Whoopi tried to spin history and Jasmine dropped receipts. This was never about canceling. This was about correcting. On YouTube, a different version went up. Split screen, low contrast, grainy but crystal clear in content. The title, Live Showdown, Jasmine Crockett confronts Whoopi Goldberg on Holocaust comments, unedited. It hit trending by the hour mark. That night, it would be clipped and remixed over 600 times, used in video essays, news commentary, political TikToks, and even fan edits. Some featured the sound of a gavel slamming over Jasmine's closing words. Others cut to black as she pushed the paper forward, punctuated by silence as sharp as any verdict. On Twitter, still a war zone of attention, the moment became a line in the sand. The hashtags surged with the kind of kinetic clarity the internet rarely achieves. Rishish Crockett Barviz Whoopi, Shamarch, Holocaust is racism, Shamarun, truth on the view. The second one trended globally. By hour 2, threads erupted from every political and ideological corner. Jewish academics, Black historians, trauma experts, former television producers, Holocaust survivors, and the painfully anonymous teens with usernames like @Z00, MLUVVER92, and BRUNCHCOMMUNIST. They weren't saying the same thing, but they were echoing the same truth. That moment was not just uncomfortable, it was necessary. At Yeshiva University, Dr. Leah Stern, a Holocaust historian who rarely posted outside of lectures, broke protocol and tweeted simply, "When someone says the Holocaust wasn't about race, they enable the exact mechanism that made it possible." Thank you. At Jasmine 4TX, Yad Vashem issued a brief but pointed statement by nightfall. We support efforts to correct public misrepresentations of the Holocaust. The truth must never be diluted. The Anti-Defamation League followed, posting a video with side-by-side clips. Goldberg's 2022 comment and Jasmine's rebuttal. The contrast spoke louder than any analysis. In the caption, Accountability is not attack. Clarity is not cruelty. But the most viral post didn't come from an expert. It came from a 17-year-old girl in Oakland, California, who stitched together clips of Jasmine's response with archival footage of Holocaust survivors, adding a caption that would become a rallying cry. Crockett said what millions of us think, but were never given permission to say. In the span of 5 hours, Jasmine Crockett, who had entered that studio with a folder of footnotes and a spine full of steel, had become more than a congresswoman. She was now a fulcrum in the conversation America had avoided for too long. She hadn't just corrected a narrative. She had dismantled the idea that legacy made someone too sacred to be questioned. By midnight, social media had transformed into a court of public conscience. Not perfect, not unanimous, but electric. Clips were translated into Hebrew, German, French. Holocaust education platforms embedded the segment into digital modules. Media watchdogs ran side-by-side timelines of how misinformation had spread after Goldberg's original statement in 2022, and how this one moment was already reversing some of the damage. Yet even in that rising wave of affirmation, the cracks of resistance flared. Some argued that Crockett had ambushed Goldberg, that she had weaponized shame, that calling out a black woman on live television was somehow betrayal. But those arguments didn't land with the same certainty they once might have, because Crockett had come with facts, and no amount of sentiment could scrub off the ink on the document she'd slid across that table. Meanwhile, Goldberg remained silent. No post, no statement, no follow-up appearance on The View the next morning. ABC executives reportedly went into emergency meetings overnight. Leaked emails surfaced from producers asking if the segment could be edited or scrubbed before rebroadcast. It was too late. The footage was everywhere, and more importantly, so was the clarity. News outlets debated what to call it. Cultural reckoning on live TV. Unscripted moment becomes historical turning point. Congresswoman corrects icon, sparks global conversation. But most people didn't need headlines to tell them what they'd witnessed. They had felt it. In the space between Crockett's stillness and Goldberg's fumble. In the rhythm of words delivered without anger, just precision. In the way truth had pierced legacy without apology. And perhaps most notably, in the way that moment didn't need production value to become history. It just needed someone brave enough to say, responsibility isn't measured in broadcast years. It's measured by the impact of the harm we cause when we speak wrongly and refuse to own it. Now millions could repeat it, quote it, stitch it into the fabric of their own convictions. And so the moment lived, not just in algorithms, but in memory. And for Jasmine Crockett, that was the only stage that mattered. And as the clips raced across platforms, reaching millions before sunrise, the machine that had built the show quietly slipped into damage control. At 4:13 a.m., while most of America was still scrolling through stitched TikToks and reaction videos, the corporate office at ABC released a statement, a carefully worded, PR-insulated press memo that had clearly been drafted by committee and bled of all accountability. The subject line read simply, regarding today's broadcast. No one's name was mentioned, no moment was cited, no fault was claimed. It read, in part, while The View has always welcomed difficult conversations, today's episode took a direction that exceeded our expectations. We understand that the emotional nature of live television can sometimes lead to moments that spark passionate response. We are reviewing internal procedures to ensure balance, clarity, and respect remain our highest priorities. And then, in a final line that read more like a reflex than a resolution, we thank our viewers for continuing to engage with this national conversation. The message was designed not to land, but to deflect, to pad the wound with vague regret, while refusing to admit who inflicted it or who had been forced to clean up after it. It was not a correction. It was not an apology. It was a placeholder, an invisible curtain hastily drawn across the wreckage of a moment that no longer belonged to them. Internally, the network was in freefall. Calls had come in all night, from sponsors, affiliates, board members, some demanding accountability, others demanding silence. Senior producers argued in Slack threads and Zoom calls. There was a furious attempt to retroactively insert context into what had been said, to reframe the narrative as a miscommunication rather than a reckoning. But outside the boardrooms, the public wasn't confused. They had seen the exchange unfiltered. They had heard the words. And most importantly, they had heard the silence that followed. To anyone watching with clear eyes, ABC's memo wasn't a statement. It was an admission of cowardice. It was the sound of a structure trying to save its own face without acknowledging the cost paid by the woman who had told the truth. Jasmine Crockett's name didn't appear once in the press release. Neither did Whoopi Goldberg's. The Holocaust wasn't mentioned, nor was the rise in online denial. The entire confrontation, the moment that had transfixed a nation and echoed through classrooms, synagogues, and newsrooms, was reduced to a footnote wrapped in euphemism. And yet the language said everything. Exceeded our expectations. That was how they framed a moment of moral clarity, one that had only happened because Jasmine had refused to let legacy bend truth into something comfortable. She had entered that studio prepared. She had spoken calmly, clearly, without personal attack or sensationalism. She had cited statistics, offered historical fact, and presented her words with surgical restraint. And for that, she was now being swept under the rug by the very institution that had invited her to speak in the first place. By 6 a.m., the memo had been picked apart by journalists and commentators on both sides of the aisle. One CNN anchor called it a case study in how corporate language erases accountability. A journalist at The Atlantic posted a thread simply titled, "How to Say Nothing in 123 Words." And on MSNBC, a legal analyst broke down the memo line by line, comparing it to the way law firms draft public-facing statements after internal misconduct. But to Jasmine Crockett, none of it was surprising. She had seen this pattern before, had watched institutions fold in on themselves the moment truth disrupted their choreography. She knew they wouldn't name her, just like they rarely name black women who told inconvenient truths without tears. She wasn't the victim. She didn't want to be, but she also refused to be erased. So instead of responding with rage, she responded with proof. That morning at 8:32 a.m., she posted a single tweet. No hashtags, no quote tweet of the memo. Just 4 words followed by a PDF attachment. I brought the receipts. The file was a time-stamped, source-cited 8-page brief detailing the rise of Holocaust denialism on social platforms in the weeks following Whoopi Goldberg's original 2022 comments, cross-referenced with ADL reports, social graph data, and content screenshots. It was the same brief she had prepared for The View, a copy of which now sat somewhere in a drawer beneath Goldberg's desk, unopened. Within 20 minutes, her tweet had over 300,000 likes. Within 2 hours, it had been embedded in stories by The Guardian, NPR, and The New York Times. And while ABC scrambled to protect its image with vagueness, Jasmine had made the truth portable, downloadable, shareable, undeniable. Because that was the difference between power and integrity. Power hides, integrity uploads. But when institutions hide, something else always rises to meet the silence. And Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for anyone to give her permission to speak. Less than 36 hours after ABC's memo fell flat in inboxes across the country, Crockett went live. No stage, no makeup team, no stylized lighting or polished camera angles. Just her, sitting in her own living room, books stacked behind her, a plain navy blazer over a black shirt, laptop open to one side, a printed binder in front of her that matched the one she'd carried into The View. She didn't open with a smile. She didn't apologize for the weight of the conversation. She opened with 6 seconds of silence, holding the camera's gaze the way she had held the room 2 days earlier. And then she said, "Let's talk about language. Let's talk about responsibility. And let's talk about power." That was the tone. Not combative, not wounded, surgical. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't name Whoopi Goldberg once. But what she did do, meticulously, powerfully, was name a pattern. For the next 57 minutes, Jasmine Crockett walked the audience through 10 years of precedent. 6 cases, 6 moments when media institutions had shielded powerful figures, actors, anchors, producers, even hosts of national shows, after they'd made statements or decisions that endangered truth, distorted history, or harmed marginalized communities. She didn't dramatize, she cited. Each example came with timestamps, news coverage, reactions, and, where available, data on public misinformation spikes that followed. One case was a beloved comedian who dismissed police brutality as a messaging issue. Another, a prominent network host who once claimed indigenous genocide was overstated. Then a news anchor who called trans identity a phase, a segment that was aired 3 times in syndication before it was quietly pulled. Long after the harm had been done, each case was presented not as gossip, but as evidence. Not to shame, but to show. Crockett paused only once, 35 minutes in, to let a graph hold the screen. A bar chart of social media denial traffic before and after major broadcast statements across a decade. No narration, just data. Tens of thousands of viewers were already in the stream at that point, but by minute 43, the comment counter began freezing. Not from lack of interaction, but from too much. The server lagged. YouTube's live chat couldn't keep up. Someone in the back-end tech team had to manually slow the data flow just to stabilize the stream. By the time she reached the closing paragraph, scripted, yes, but delivered with the poise of someone who had lived every word, the viewership had passed 6 million. She ended not with a call out, but a call forward. I'm not here to cancel anyone. I'm here to remind us that the mic isn't a trophy. It's a responsibility. And if we want truth to survive in this country, then we have to stop pretending that fame is a substitute for accountability. Integrity isn't measured in how long you've been speaking. It's measured in whether you're willing to correct yourself when you get it wrong. She looked into the lens, blinked once, then ended the stream. No music, no outro, just a fade to black. It was 9:41 p.m. By 10:12 p.m., clips from the live stream were everywhere. One TikTok cut together her line, "The mic isn't a trophy," with a rapid montage of old, problematic talk show clips. Applause for bad takes, audiences cheering at bigotry cloaked in comedy, viral moments that had aged like milk. It was viewed 1.2 million times in an hour. A young activist on Instagram posted, "We don't need performative apologies. We need documents, timelines, receipts." Crockett gave us all 3. At Harvard, a history professor paused mid-lecture the next morning, opened the live stream recording, and played a 2-minute excerpt on media ethics and historical distortion. Cornell uploaded it to their open-source syllabus within 12 hours. By 24 hours post-stream, the full video had over 12 million views. But while the numbers rose, another current began to gather momentum beneath the surface. One Jasmine had anticipated, but hadn't initiated. It began on Reddit. A post in r/television titled, "Is it time for Whoopi to step down?" At first it was a mix, some angry, some defensive. But within 200 comments, the thread had shifted tone. Screenshots of Whoopi's original 2022 comments were posted next to transcripts from the recent episode. Holocaust scholars were quoted. ADL's statement was linked. Someone dug up a 2009 interview where Goldberg dismissed the Me Too movement before it began. Receipts stacked on receipts. Then the Change.org petition hit. It was written simply, "The View deserves truth, not tenure. Replace Whoopi Goldberg." It launched with 300 signatures. Within 4 hours, it had 50,000. By the end of the next day, 180,000. And quietly, without a headline, without fanfare, ABC issued an internal order. Goldberg would be temporarily stepping away to rest and reflect. It wasn't announced publicly, it was leaked. Producers scrambled to rearrange schedules. Guest hosts were contacted. Emergency roundtables were suggested, but none of it could match the clarity of what had already happened. Whoopi hadn't been shouted down. She had been outpaced. By truth. By documentation. By a woman who didn't need the last word, because she had already given the one that mattered. And when the noise finally began to taper, the petitions, the think pieces, the nightly segments breaking down Crockett's every sentence. What followed was not silence, but a kind of gravitational stillness. The kind that settles over the battlefield after the last shot is fired, when no one is sure whether the war's over or merely paused. It was in that stillness, 1 week after the live stream, that both women were invited into the same room again, this time not on camera. There would be no lights, no audience, no applause, only a room, 2 chairs, a closed door, and a history neither of them could walk away from without facing the other directly. The invitation came from an independent cultural foundation based in Chicago, an institution known for organizing reconciliation forums between public figures after major civic fractures. But this wasn't some theater of performative healing. There would be no mediator, no timed statements, no cameras to capture handshakes for social media. The terms were clear: no staff, no scripts, no retellings, just 45 minutes behind locked doors, inside a neutral space. If anything emerged, it would be whatever the two women chose to carry with them on the way out. The meeting took place on the top floor of a historic museum, long closed for renovations, now repurposed into something closer to a truth chamber. The air was chilled, the lighting low but clean. There were no stage lights, no microphones, just two high-backed chairs facing each other, placed beneath a skylight that poured in gray winter sun like divine interrogation. Crockett arrived first, dressed in navy, no entourage. She carried no documents, no folders, no briefcase. Only a single note card, folded once, tucked into her coat pocket. She didn't pace. She didn't look around. She sat in the chair, back straight, hands folded, eyes resting not on the room, but on the idea of what it meant to be in that room. 5 minutes later, Goldberg entered. She wore dark sunglasses, though the lighting didn't require them. Her steps were slower than usual, not theatrical, but heavy, weighted. She carried a phone in one hand, but never once looked down at it. She didn't offer a smile. She nodded, a small, stiff gesture, and took her seat. And then the door closed. From that point forward, no one truly knows what was said. No transcript, no leak, not even whispers from nearby rooms. Whatever passed between them stayed inside the concrete, inside the walls, inside the silence that wrapped around their final confrontation like a cord pulled tight. But afterward, when the meeting ended and the door clicked open, a single detail slipped through. A building security officer, stationed near the elevator, watched them exit. He wasn't a journalist. He wasn't an insider. Just a man doing his job, standing beside a polished brass panel, eyes trained forward. And later, when asked by a colleague what he saw, he said this: only one of them walked out with her spine straight and her eyes forward. The other kept her head down, didn't say a word. That sentence spread like fire on cold wind. Journalists tried to confirm. There was nothing official, no statements, no tweets, no soft focus selfie to signal resolution. Just that one account, unverified, but believable in the way truth often is when it doesn't try to sell itself. Within hours, speculation ignited. Rumors bloomed like bruises beneath the surface of the media circuit. Whoopi Goldberg was planning to step away from The View permanently. Not just a hiatus, not just a seasonal pause, a full exit. Whispers turned into columns. Anonymous sources close to production reported that ABC was quietly drafting statements, evaluating replacements, workshopping language that sounded like evolution instead of retirement. No one confirmed it, but no one denied it either. And that silence, strategic, suffocating, said more than any press release could. Some said it was inevitable, that Goldberg had held the seat too long, that the cultural conversation had outrun her. That legacy couldn't stretch far enough to cover the damage done. Others called it betrayal, that a black woman had been dragged down by another, that Crockett had broken ranks, shattered solidarity. But most people knew better. This wasn't about identity, it was about truth. And what happens when someone finally refuses to treat truth like a dinner guest who needs to be made comfortable? What mattered wasn't who walked in first, it was who walked out standing. Jasmine Crockett didn't post a word about the meeting. She made no victory lap, no morning show appearance, no magazine cover shoot about the day I spoke up. She simply returned to work, introduced a bill on hate speech algorithms, took meetings with historians, spoke to students, and when asked about the closed-door conversation, she offered only this: I didn't go in there to win. I went in there to finish what started on that stage. What came out of it, that belongs to both of us. She didn't blink, didn't elaborate, didn't have to, because every movement needs a moment, and every moment needs someone who doesn't flinch. And in that room, silent, off air, with nothing left to hide behind, America learned who that person truly was. And so, as headlines cooled and platforms moved on, as networks filled the time slot Goldberg once occupied with new faces and safer topics, Jasmine Crockett did not bask in victory. She did not gloat or tour or reduce that moment to a soundbite. Instead, she boarded a plane to Jerusalem. No camera crew, no entourage, no press releases. Just her, a black journal, and the invitation that had arrived quietly 3 weeks earlier. A handwritten letter from Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center. It bore only 2 lines beneath the official seal. We followed what happened. When you are ready, we would like you to speak. Not about her, about memory. The sky was overcast when she arrived. Cool wind threaded through the stone courtyards and quiet sculptures. Security was discreet, but present. Inside the Hall of Remembrance, 12 chairs were arranged in 2 rows. No stage, no podium. The walls were bare, save for the soft outline of the eternal flame, flickering behind bulletproof glass. This was not a place for performances. It was a place where silence lived, where the weight of memory bent even the strongest voices into reverence. Jasmine wore black, a modest suit, her hair pulled back. No jewelry, no pins, no flag. Just one sheet of paper folded twice, and the title printed in plain serif at the top. Words are not harmless. They build history or destroy it. When she stepped forward, no music played. There was no introduction, just the soft creak of shoes against stone and the collective breath of a room waiting for something it hadn't heard in years. Moral clarity, spoken not in the defense of power, but in its absence. She unfolded the page, and she began. When I was a child, my grandfather told me stories that didn't belong to our family, but lived inside it anyway. He was born in Texas, never left the country, but he kept a book on his shelf, worn at the edges, spine torn, Hebrew on the cover. I asked him once why he, a black man from the American South, read about Auschwitz. He said, because they tried to erase them the way they tried to erase us. And the moment we forget their names, we give them permission to start again. She paused, not for effect, for breath, for weight. I never forgot that. And years later, when I sat across from someone who tried to make the Holocaust something less than what it was, I didn't speak because I was offended. I spoke because I was afraid of what silence might allow. The room remained still. No phones buzzed, no murmurs escaped. She continued. Words are not harmless. They're not neutral. They don't float through the air untouched. They land, they plant, they grow, or they poison. In every genocide, there were words before there were weapons. In every erasure, there was language before there was law. Her voice did not rise, it deepened. And when we allow those words to be bent, to comfort the powerful, to pacify the masses, to rewrite what is unbearable, we are not being sensitive. We are being complicit. She looked around the room then, not up, not down, just directly into the eyes of survivors, scholars, children of history who had watched too many truths be negotiated into footnotes. There are no neutral microphones. There are no harmless distortions. When someone says the Holocaust wasn't about race, they are not just wrong. They are dismantling the very framework that allowed it to happen. Because the Nazi regime did not ask questions about ethnicity. They codified it. They measured skulls. They mapped bloodlines. They marked passports. And they turned that bureaucracy of identity into death. Another pause. Deeper now, more intimate. She softened, but she did not yield. And I understand the fear that comes with saying the wrong thing. I've said the wrong thing. I've apologized. I've learned. But there is a difference between an honest mistake and a public refusal to accept correction. One can be taught. The other must be confronted. She stepped 1 foot forward, narrowing the space between herself and the flame. That is why I came here. Not to accuse, not to relive, but to remember. Because when we forget, or worse, when we distort, what happened to 6 million Jews, we do not just erase them. We burn away part of our collective conscience. Then came the final line. Quiet, measured, a closing sentence that would echo through universities, memorials, and newsrooms for years. When we warp memory for politics, we are not just lying, we are setting fire to the shared soul of humanity. She folded the paper in half and stepped back. No applause followed, only silence. Deep, clean, holy. The kind of silence that doesn't ask to be broken. A rabbi placed a stone on the edge of the memorial behind her. A young girl, no older than 10, leaned into her father's chest and whispered something in Hebrew. Crockett did not ask what was said. She did not need to know. She had come to speak truth, not for approval, not for legacy, but for repair. Outside, under gray skies, reporters stood at a respectful distance. She did not stop to answer questions. She walked past them slowly, eyes forward, spine straight. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman or a voice in a viral clip. She was something rarer, a guardian of memory. And for the first time in weeks, the world was quiet again. Not because it had forgotten, but because someone had finally made remembering sacred. And as the last word echoed off the stone walls of Yad Vashem, and Jasmine Crockett disappeared into the cold Jerusalem wind, something deeper than silence settled across those who had borne witness. Not just in that room, but across the world. It wasn't closure, it wasn't comfort, it was reckoning. The kind that doesn't soothe, but scars. That doesn't applaud, but alters. Because what had taken place wasn't just a media storm or a cultural clash. It was a confrontation with a question most people spend their lives trying to avoid. What does it cost to speak the truth when silence is safer? The answer, it turns out, is everything. Because if there was one thing this story refused to offer, it was safety. Jasmine Crockett had walked into a battlefield disguised as a studio and refused to flinch. She had faced down not just a legacy, but a room curated to protect that legacy. She had done it without screaming, without spectacle. And in return, she had faced the full inertia of a system that punishes clarity more than it ever punishes cruelty. There was no script for what she did, no blueprint, no guarantee she would be believed or backed or even heard. But she did it anyway. And that, perhaps more than anything, is where the human lesson lives. The lesson is not that power will fold when confronted with truth. It rarely does. The lesson is that power flinches, even if only for a moment, when truth is spoken without fear. And in that flinch, in that blink of hesitation, in that tightening of the jaw, or that glance toward the floor, we see the crack. And through the crack, we glimpse possibility. Because legacy, no matter how polished, cannot withstand the weight of a single documented truth delivered without apology. And Crockett did not just speak one truth. She spoke a pattern. She drew a map. She laid out how misinformation metastasizes inside institutions, how platforms shield power from consequence, and how soft complicity disguises itself as nuance. She did it with data. She did it with calm. She did it while carrying the burden that every Black woman in public life knows too well, the burden of having to be flawless while pointing out someone else's failure. She was not angry. She was not cruel. But she was not soft either. And that too is part of the lesson. We have been trained by media, by politics, by culture, to believe that moral clarity must come wrapped in softness to be palatable. That to correct a wrong, one must do so gently enough that the wrongdoer does not bruise. But justice has never been gentle. Truth has never been easy. And history does not remember the women who whispered when the world needed volume. Jasmine Crockett did not go viral because she was dramatic. She went viral because she was undeniable. She reminded us that language is not a toy and legacy is not armor. She reminded us that platforms are not personal shields and that fame, when wielded without accountability, becomes erosion of memory, of culture, of truth. She reminded us that the Holocaust is not a debate point. It is not a rhetorical tool. It is not up for reframing by those who find its reality too inconvenient to carry. She reminded us that history once distorted is no longer history, it is propaganda, and that if we allow even one distortion to go unchallenged, we risk watching 6 million dead be rewritten into footnotes. But the lesson goes deeper than that. It is not just about Holocaust denial, It is about every moment where truth is inconvenient, every room where someone chooses silence over confrontation, every meeting where a slur goes unchecked, every news segment where both sides are presented as equally factual, every dinner table where history is rewritten because no one wants to upset the mood. Jasmine Crockett did what most people, most institutions refuse to do. She chose to be uncomfortable. She chose to make the room uncomfortable. And in doing so, she gave the rest of us a blueprint, not for outrage, but for honesty. She showed us how to correct without cruelty, how to document without drama, how to stand without shouting. And in a world that rewards spectacle over substance, that may be the most radical act of all. She paid a price for that act. Let us not forget, she was mischaracterized, she was accused of betrayal, she was accused of attacking a fellow Black woman, she was accused of exploiting trauma for attention. But through it all, she never changed her tone, never spun, never retaliated. Because she wasn't fighting a person, she was fighting an idea. The idea that power is always right. The idea that legacy cannot be questioned. The idea that fame grants immunity from fact. And by breaking that idea in full view of the nation, she gave birth to something rare. The hope that maybe, just maybe, truth can still win. Not quickly, not loudly, but definitively. She didn't win because the internet clapped. She didn't win because petitions were signed. She didn't win because a speech trended on TikTok. She won because she told the truth, on the record, and let the consequences come. That is the final lesson. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak the truth, knowing it won't protect you, knowing it might hurt you, knowing it might cost you everything you've built, and still speaking it calmly, clearly, publicly. Because truth, like memory, is not meant to be easy. It's meant to be sacred. And Jasmine Crockett reminded us what sacred sounds like. But if her courage meant anything, if her clarity was more than a fleeting headline, then it cannot end with applause. It cannot be reduced to a clip, a caption, or a standing ovation before everyone moves on. Because what Jasmine Crockett gave us was not just a moment of moral reckoning. She handed us a mirror. And in that mirror, each of us must now ask, what am I protecting with my silence? What truth have I swallowed to keep peace at the table, to protect a brand, to keep my job, to avoid discomfort? What lie have I allowed to grow roots while I look the other way? So now it is our turn, not to trend, not to perform, but to act. Call out the distortion. Speak up in the room that wasn't built for your voice. Challenge the headline. Interrupt the narrative that smooths over cruelty with comfort. When someone bends history into a shape that fits their politics, straighten it, out loud, publicly. Not because it's easy, but because the truth deserves someone who doesn't flinch. And if institutions won't protect memory, then it falls to individuals. If networks won't name the harm, then we must. Because the next time a Holocaust is denied, a genocide is softened, or a survivor's name is erased, it won't happen in silence. It'll happen in rooms where someone knew the truth and chose not to speak. You can be the exception. Be the one who says, not here, not anymore, not in front of me. This isn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It's about every moment you've ever been handed a microphone, literal or not, and had to decide, will I use it to be safe or to be true? Because words are not harmless. They build history, or they destroy it. The choice is yours. Which will you leave behind? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.